Hello, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today for MindCORE's weekly faculty seminar. MindCORE is a Center for Mind and Brain at the University of Pennsylvania, and we are holding these talks every Wednesday at noon with the faculty who are supervising some of our summer student fellows this year. I hope that you will find today's talk very interesting. Today we're going to be joined by Professor Jonathan Barron, who is an emeritus professor in the Department of Psychology at Penn, and he is going to be talking about actively open-minded thinking. Just a few little basics for how this works. If this is your first time here, you are welcome to post questions within the chat, if they're just sort of casual questions or if there's something that you missed, and you're welcome to answer questions there too. If you have a question for the speaker, there will be a few pauses where we'll ask questions of our speaker today. You can post that in the Ask a Question section, the little menu bar along the bottom of your screen. And then there's actually an opportunity in there to upvote or downvote questions. And so typically I'll just start to read the questions from the top, and the ones that are most popular are the ones that get asked. So with that, I'm going to focus our screen over here on Professor Barron. And there he is. Would you like me to bring up your, have your slides be the main focus actually?
Yeah, that would be good. Oh, okay. So, ready? Should
I think we're ready. It's okay. All you. Thank you again.
So I'm going to be looking at my slides. I'm not, because I have to look at them to control them. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've sort of been working on since 1985, but this is the latest, and some of the stuff at the end, if I get to it, is hot off the press and a little confusing to me anyway. And my recent interest in this topic started with an interest in citizenship, of the political sort. And it occurred to me that many problems in the world are the result of citizens, particularly voters, not behaving in ways that are as helpful as they might be. And it occurs all over the world, and takes many forms: populism, corruption, advocacy of poor policies, isolationism, and so on. And these bad decisions that voters make hurt people, and in some cases they're a major cause of suffering in the world. But we can solve them by acting in our roles as citizens. Most of the time it's cheap. That is, we can just vote. It's not even like giving to charity that requires a sacrifice in money. And if everyone voted for whatever is best for the world, we might even come closer to achieving that than we are right now. I won't dwell on the examples. I take a utilitarian point of view on all this, which is that the best decisions are those that make things as good as possible for everybody affected. And when you apply that view to citizenship, it leads to a certain view of what the virtues of good citizens are. One is what I call cosmopolitanism, which is a focus on everybody, not just yourself, which is the smallest group, or yourself and your family, or your nation. And that's sort of a continuum, and it's a continuous variable, but it takes its more, I will assume that it's more serious form right now as nationalism. But it can also involve racism, sexism, anything that affects a group and doesn't take into account effects on outgroups. So in-group bias is another word for the bad part. Another virtue is opposition to moralism, which is the imposition of our beliefs on other people in a way that we cannot defend to them and explain to them. And And a lot of that comes from very traditional beliefs. Some of them are religious, not all, that are passed on from generation to generation. And much of what we call the Enlightenment in the 16th and 15th and 16th and 17th centuries was opposition to these kinds of things and a willingness to question. So I'll be coming back to that. A third virtue is what I'll mainly be talking about, which is actively open-minded thinking, which includes active search for reasons why a pet idea might be wrong, fair inference from what we found, and confidence that it's appropriate, given the strength or weakness of the evidence we have. And actively open-minded thinking is a set of standards for how we ought to think. When we endorse those standards, we try to apply them to ourselves and sometimes succeed, and we also apply them to others, which is very important in politics because we are incapable of thinking about everything ourselves. We need to rely on other people. In the rest of this talk, I'll be talking a lot about correlations, a measure of a relationship between one trait and another trait. Here's an example of a fairly large correlation for individual differences. So in this graph, each point is a subject, a person who filled out a questionnaire. There are about 100. The horizontal axis is a measure of actively open-minded thinking. The vertical axis is a measure of belief in divine command theory, which is the belief that we are not capable of reasoning about morality ourselves, but we have to rely on the word of God without understanding. And you can think that that would be sort of in opposition to the idea of actively open-minded thinking, and it is. So there's a negative correlation here. And as we measure these things, this is minus 0.61, which is very large for the kind of correlations I'll be talking about. And yet you can see it's not perfect at all. It's sort of, there's a lot of variations, and you can sort of see the trend that as actively open-minded thinking gets lower on the left, belief in divine command theory gets higher. And that's the result. What the interesting fact is that I'll be talking about started with my observation that there's what psychologists call a positive manifold in various measures. The term comes from the study of IQ tests. In an IQ test, good IQ tests have a bunch of different measures like digit span, vocabulary, solving puzzles. And the interesting thing about those is that everything correlates with everything else. People who do well on one part of the IQ test tend to do well on other parts of the IQ test, and just about anything else that involves cognitive abilities. So, and yet, and the fact that these things all correlate on the IQ test has not been fully explained. Nobody knows why it happens. And likewise, the same thing is going to happen here. This idea of the measures of actively open-minded thinking correlate with a whole bunch of other things, many of them having to do with politics, which also correlate with each other. So and I'll be illustrating this tediously. And the general finding is that everything correlates with everything else. For example, parochialism, which is in the form of nationalism, such as opposition to immigration, social conservatism, that is belief in the old time-tested ways handed down to us for thousands of years. Belief in religion, which is a little bit related to social conservatism, but not all religion, especially those parts of it that essentially deny our ability to understand things for ourselves. Divine command theory is an example. The other part of it is deontology, which is moral systems that are based on rules, rights, and duties. This is often in opposition to utilitarianism, which is the view that I tend to take. And a lot of these rules come from religions. So it's not surprising that the belief that we should follow rules even when they lead to worse outcomes is sort of not correlated with utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is itself correlated with actively open-minded thinking. I'm really not sure why. That's one of the big puzzles. And also acceptance of actively open-minded thinking as a standard, and trust in science. All these things, everything correlates with everything. And I want to focus later, if I get to it, on two possible sources of these correlations, and I think probably both are true. One is cultural diversity. That is, when we do these studies of individual differences, we usually sample subjects, people, to fill out the questionnaires from some society or group, usually a country. Within that group, we may be sampling very different cultures. Take, for example, Turkey. This may sound familiar, but Turkey is a culturally diverse country. On the western edge, the northwestern edge, is Istanbul, which is essentially a European city with highly educated people who tend to see themselves as European. They're not as religious at all as the rest of Turkey. And then back in the hinterlands are people who think of themselves as not all that different from their ancestors 2,000 years ago. And or 1,000 years. They follow the same traditions. They're time-tested, trusted. And this creates a political division within Turkey. Other countries have a similar sort of division. You might, like the United States, that is somewhat regional, but not entirely. And so one source of this is that we're mixing up different groups of people. And that accounts for the correlations that we find. In one group, you have people who favor actively open-minded thinking. They're not as religious, not as traditional. They have higher belief in science, and that's just the way it happens. And if that's the cause, then the answer is not in psychology. It's somewhere else: anthropology, sociology, the study of cultural evolution, as to why we have these splits. But then there's another explanation that is in psychology, which is that people differ in the way they think, the way they reach conclusions in their beliefs. And those beliefs themselves, those fundamental beliefs about how we should think, influence all these other things, because individuals come to different conclusions about religion. I'll come back to, so those are the two answers to the question of why this positive manifold happens. Let me turn to actively open-minded thinking now. It's a theory of good thinking. It's similar to many other theories that are similar, that try to do the same thing, but it's something I tried to do in a way that a cognitive psychologist could understand. And in my original description of this, I think it could be programmed on a computer quite easily, so easily that it's trivial. There are various objects that you think about called possibilities. There are other objects that are called pieces that I call evidence, which are arguments for and against each possibility. And there are what I have called goals, which might also be called values or criteria. For example, if you're trying to make a decision like renting an apartment or buying a house, finding a place to live, the possibilities are various apartments that you might be looking at. The evidence is facts about those apartments, the rent, the commuting distance, how nice they look, whether it has the size of the apartments, whether it has enough rooms, whether it has too many, and then your criteria are the way that you evaluate the evidence. It could be that the rent or cost is very important because you're on a tight budget, or it could be that you really care a lot about the view or something like that, or being close to public transportation, or being close to where you work, and you're willing to pay more for that. So the way you weigh these pieces of evidence depends upon your goals or values or criteria. And thinking proceeds in a cycle. We don't do these things one at a time. We get one possibility, evaluate the evidence, maybe look for another possibility, look for the evidence of that, ask why we're doing things, and go back and forth between these various processes. Actively open-minded thinking is a set of standards that says several things. When we evaluate some possibilities, we have to be fair. So it's much more important to be fair to the possibilities than just to think a lot. Some thinking is useless because all it does is bolster what we already favor. That happens. So the amount of thinking alone is not what's important. What's important is thinking that is directed at being fair to the various possibilities you're considering. The standards of actively open-minded thinking apply to others, not just ourselves. Very importantly, these standards also dictate what our confidence should be. That's a number in the model that you can assign. The general rule is that confidence should be in proportion to the evidence that we have favoring one possibility over the others. Sometimes we cannot be confident because we have two possibilities that are very close, or we have very little evidence. We haven't done any thinking. We haven't done any thinking. So one of the implications of this theory of thinking is that sometimes our confidence should be low. And in those cases, one of the really bad things is overconfidence. Overconfidence when we lack evidence. The other bad thing that we can do, the other big source of individual differences in actively open-minded thinking, is what David Perkins called my-side bias, which is that you get attached to some possibility fairly early, and possibly you've always believed it, and you're not fair. You look for evidence that favors that possibility. You dismiss evidence against it. And the result of this is that you end up confirming the possibility that you favored all along. And that's called my-side bias. Those are two of the big sort of flaws. People, the facts are that people tend to follow their own standards. People who endorse these standards tend to follow them. Of course we slip up. I endorse these standards, and sometimes I'm pig-headed and narrow-minded. And when people remind me that I am, then since I do endorse the standards, I think that that's bad. We use these standards to evaluate others. That's very important in politics. I've said that before. And actively open-minded thinking as a standard takes into account the cost of thinking. That's another fact. Sometimes thinking is useless, and we have to rely on other people. Here's just, this is parts of this. The last 2 points have been known for a long time, and I love this quote from Mill. Here's what it says: in the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct, because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him, to profit by as much of it as was just, and expound to himself the fallacy of what was fallacious. Notice two things here. He's talking about my-side bias. He's avoiding my-side bias by being actively open-minded, by looking for reasons why we might be wrong. And he's also talking about how we judge other people, how other people deserve our confidence. And that is really important. Another quote on the business about moralism, which comes from Barack Obama long before he thought of running for president, or not long before, but a bit before. This is why when I was talking before about moralistic thinking, this is an example of what I'm talking about. To say that men and women should not inject their personal morality into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality. Democracy, however, demands that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religious-specific values. It requires that their proposals be subject to argument and amenable to reason. If I am opposed to abortion for religious reasons but seek to pass a law banning that, I cannot simply point to the teachings of my church. I have to explain why abortion violates some principle that is accessible to people of all faiths, including those with no faith at all. This is about as clearly stated a rejection of moralistic values as I've ever seen. Okay, so how do we measure actively open-minded thinking? I measure it as acceptance of the norms, of the standards for thinking itself. Here's a questionnaire that I've been using a lot. If you were here last year, I actually gave this to a group and had them talk out loud while they were doing it. We can't do that given this form of presentation. But here are some of the things that I take to be values that we can measure. I won't go through the whole list because I'm seeing we're already getting short of time. But some of the critical ones, well, they're all pretty critical. You should take into your willingness to be convinced by opposing arguments is a sign of good character. That's right out of Mill. People should take into consideration evidence that goes against conclusions they favor. Being undecided or unsure is the result of muddled thinking. That's reverse scored. That is, people who believe in actively open-minded thinking do not think that being undecided or unsure is so bad. It's necessary, and so on. And I guess the other questions are sort of redundant with some of those. So this is the scale I use now to measure acceptance of the values of actively open-minded thinking. Okay, are there any questions at this point that I need to answer?
I actually have a question. So the question is, how does my side bias differ from confirmation bias?
Good question. The answer is it doesn't. And the reason the term, the reason that Perkins used that term in the early 1980s was because at that time, the term confirmation bias in psychology was used for an entirely different phenomenon that has nothing to do with my side bias. I won't go into the details. If you want to look at my textbook, there's a whole discussion of the history of this idea. So confirmation bias is it, but as the word is used now. Okay. But a lot of the literature in psychology now uses the term my side bias, and they mean the same thing.
Interesting.
Another question.
That was actually our only one, and you got to thank you for that. So you can keep going with your presentation. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post them with the Ask a Question or in the chat. Okay, so back to the story. So I'm now going to talk about a whole bunch of correlations. One of the most on the question of parochialism or nationalism. No one's ever really measured that very well in the United States, but it so happens that in 2016, this massive survey of thousands of British voters used my scale.
to measure actively open-minded thinking, and they also measured attitudes toward Brexit. Should Great Britain leave the European Union? And here are some of the questions they asked. They asked tons of questions, and these are the ones that I picked out as examples that ought to illustrate parochialism or nationalism, in the form of nationalism in Great Britain. And here's the results of the survey. I'll be showing a lot of graphs like this. These are correlations. So each row or column is a measure. AOT is my measure of actively open-minded thinking. Brexit is the score on the questions I just showed you. That is belief, that the sort of nationalistic belief that Great Britain should get out of the European Union. This correlation of minus 0.38 was, to me, astoundingly high. I just didn't believe that was what was going on in the British referendum on Brexit, but it was. I mean, in some ways it's not high, but for this kind of a correlation, it's pretty high. The correlations were lower for right-wing ideology. There was a positive correlation, but fairly low, with the belief that global warming is caused by humans, also a correlation with education, and a positive correlation with being non-religious, as you can see. And all these things correlated with each other. So that's an example of the positive manifold in Great Britain. Other correlations. People who think actively open-mindedly themselves as measured by a test where they have to give reasons for something, that predicts judgments of other people's thinking. So people's own thinking and people's judgments of other people's thinking are correlated. The minus 0.61 was that correlation I showed you at the beginning between actively open-minded thinking and divine command theory. I'm not going to explain correction for attenuation right now. It correlates about 0.3 with, which is lower, with utilitarian responses in moral dilemmas. Like, would you, an example is, would you approve a vaccine that prevented 1,000 people from a serious disease, but gave 100 people the same disease from the vaccine? And a lot of people would not. But the utilitarian answer is that you should, because it's going to lead to fewer people getting the disease. We may face this choice. There's a negative correlation with political conservatism, mostly social conservatism. Economic conservatism is much less consistent. It's a fairly large negative correlation with supernatural religious beliefs, like the idea that God intervenes in real life, and with superstitious beliefs. And there's also a negative correlation with belief in conspiracy theories and paranormal beliefs. In some of the correlations I want to show you, there's another measure that's often used to measure what I think is reflective thinking, and it consists of some problems, trick problems like this. A bat and ball together cost $1.20. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Well, a lot of people say it costs 10 cents, and that's wrong. I will let you puzzle over that, but wait, is that right? Anyway, I'll let you deal with that. It's a trick problem anyway, and the question is, if you get it right, that means you're checking your original answer. Actually, anyway, 20 cents is the trick, I guess. But all right, so here's a bunch of correlations from a study I did. The one I've already mentioned, the correlation of actively open-minded thinking. This is I did with a bunch of other people. There's the minus 0.61 with the divine command scale. The stuff in the upper right is corrected. I'm not going to explain that. There's the actively open-minded thinking correlates with the cognitive reflection test. It also correlates with the time spent on the cognitive reflection test. It correlates with a scale of utilitarian moral beliefs and with utilitarian choices. And all those things correlate with each other. Here's another study from someone else who used this scale to measure beliefs in acceptance of fake news. The actively open-minded thinking scale correlates minus 0.32 with acceptance of fake news. And these were judged by actual news stories. They also gave real news stories to just see if maybe actively open-minded people didn't believe anything. Well, no, there's a small positive correlation. So the people who accept the standards of actively open-minded thinking are better at distinguishing fake news from real news. There's also a correlation with the cognitive reflection test, a negative correlation with delusional ideation, political dogmatism, and religious fundamentalism. And again, all those things correlate with each other. Okay, here's a study that I did with an undergraduate and he made up the items for the first part of it. And the idea was to see if people would respond to signs of my-side bias in political statements of the sort that might occur in tweets. He actually looked for tweets and didn't find any that were really good, and so he made them up. And here's one of his examples. The subjects in this study were given 2 of these tweets. First one, it would be flat out irresponsible to oppose tuition-free access to community or technical college programs. It will create a wave of new workers prepared for the 21st century economy. The second one, tuition-free access to community or technical college programs will create a wave of new workers prepared for the 21st century economy. Yes, it is expensive, but it is worth the price. So the second one acknowledges a counter-argument, showing that the person who made this statement has thought of it and understands that there is a disadvantage to this proposal. And we asked our subjects, how much can you trust each of these 2 people? And how fairly has the speaker thought about the topic? And what we found is that people who accepted the standards of actively open-minded thinking were more inclined to trust the second person. And they thought the second person was fair. And this actually even reversed. People who were low in actively open-minded thinking actually thought the blanket statement without acknowledgement, the type 1 statement, was better and more trustworthy. The second part of this study had to do with expressions of confidence. I've pointed out that overconfidence is one of the symptoms of failure of actively open-minded thinking, and we should recognize overconfidence in people as a sign of their own lack of actively open-minded thinking. So I presented people with pairs of statements made by different people. This one was from the Aquila earthquake in Italy. There was something like this actually happened. Those tremors don't mean anything, an earthquake won't happen. Or those tremors probably don't mean anything, an earthquake is unlikely. What he actually said, it wasn't a scientist, and he said, just sit back with a nice glass of Montepulciano and relax. And then that was right before the major earthquake. And then I also asked for trust. How much could you trust each person? And again, the difference correlated 0.47 with endorsement of actively open-minded thinking. So people who accept the standards of actively open-minded thinking thought the more cautious statement was more trustworthy than the less cautious statement. Okay, another quick pause for questions. I think I might actually get done.
Yeah, you can keep going.
No. Okay, I'm going to go on.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last part is a new study in which we, this is with Ozan Islar and Onurkan Yilmaz. They're Turkish, but this was done in the United States. And, or not really, it was just whoever showed up for my study. Most of them are Americans. And the idea here was to do what I'd really like to do is look at how people develop their what I call cognitively liberal attitudes over the course of their life. So what we really should do is study people in early adolescence and come back in 10 or 20 years and look at them. And we don't have time or money to do that. I probably don't have time to do that. So I asked people to do it retrospectively by travel, and so I called it a time travel experiment. I told them that was what it was. I want you to go back. I want you to answer some questions and then go back to a point in time when you were first able to answer these questions and answer them as you would have done at that point in time. And then I could look at the difference between how people answer the questions now and how they would have answered them. Well, for me, that was early adolescence, like 12 or 13, when I could understand questions like this. Before that, I couldn't. So they had to do with with many of the different traits I've been talking about. There was a bunch that measures utilitarianism. Here's all of them, but just as an example, when a moral rule leads to outcomes that are worse than those from breaking the rule, we should follow the rule. Or when a moral rule leads to outcomes that are worse than those from breaking the rule, we should break the rule. Those two are contrasts of each other, just to control for the tendency to say yes. For each item, people had to say completely disagree on a 1 to 5 scale, completely disagree to completely agree. So there was utilitarianism. There's 3 items for belief in divine command theory from an earlier study. The truth about morality is revealed only by God, and so on. There are 3 questions about religion, a belief in God, the converse of that, God and gods do not exist despite what people believe, and I consider myself a religious person. Those 3 questions correlate with each other. They're sort of just a measure of religious intensity that tends to not correlate with actively open-minded thinking, although I don't believe that it's that good a measure, unlike divine command theory, which I think is inherently opposed to divine command, to actively open-minded thinking, because it denies our ability to think. There are a lot of, I'm sure that there are a lot of very good actively open-minded thinkers who do believe in God. So this is a rough correlation here, but it works. Then there's a bunch of questions on political attitudes, which I just called liberalism. And it asks about traditional values, customs, and morality have a lot wrong with them. Society is so. The idea here was that if political conservatism means anything, it's attachment to the old ways. There's a big literature on what that might mean. In the United States, it means political conservatism. In communist countries, it tends to mean the opposite. This was mostly United States, so these things tended to correlate with each other. So we just looked at those. And then finally, people answered the questions for the same scale that I showed you before. And after each item, they answered the question, answered the item, and then said, how would you have answered this question earlier in your life? How would those who brought you up have wanted you to answer these questions? I call that background. And then please indicate which of the following influences on your views are relevant, even if they did not lead to any changes. And the two most interesting ones, I'll focus on those, are I thought about things like this myself, and people involved in my upbringing influenced me or tried to influence me. We also included those other things to save time. I'm just going to skip those. Other people, formal education. They didn't show anything that interesting. As usual, I got the positive manifold. That is, everything correlates with everything. The utilitarian scale, the entries here in the diagonals are measures of reliability, how well the scale measures what it's supposed to measure. And the utilitarian scale wasn't very good, but it was good enough. You like it to be higher than that. But it does correlate with rejection of divine command theory. I've now changed the signs of these so that the liberal side is always positive. It correlates positively with rejection of religion, and positively with liberal political ideology, and positively with actively open-minded thinking. And all these things correlate with each other pretty highly, actually, for this kind of a test. So the thing I was most interested in was the change from the past to the present. So here's a graph showing that change, the simple differences, the average difference in the score on that 0 to 5 scale, or 1 to 5 scale. Then it's not very great. People mostly stayed the same, but you could see that all the items, almost all the items changed in a positive direction. That means everything changed to be on the more liberal side, the more cognitively liberal side. People became more utilitarian relative to what they would have thought in the past. They believed less in divine command theory. They were less religious than they remembered themselves as being. And they were much more accepting of the standards of actively open-minded thinking than they were in the past. The big exception here is politics. There was no change. They were not more politically liberal than they were in the past. So that didn't change. That's life. So keep that in mind, although I may remind you of it. And also we can look at what they thought about their own past and how that differed from their upbringing, their background. And they were, even in adolescence or whatever, they were more cognitively liberal than those who raised them. And that was pretty much across the board, including politics, which may be why they didn't change so much in politics, because they already had. That is, they were more liberal than their parents were, even when they were adolescents. That may be what's going on there. I mean, if we believe this. But so one question you ask is, the next question is, could this be caused by their own thinking? Could people who accept the standards of actively open-minded thinking be the ones who change the most in the other beliefs that they have? So what I did in order to get their measure of their general endorsement of actively open-minded thinking, I combined their endorsement in the past and their endorsement in the present to get an overall measure, and looked at how that predicted other changes. Well, it did predict, you can see, the change in religion. That is, people who were more inclined to endorse actively open-minded thinking whenever we measured this became less religious and less believing in divine command theory over the course of their lives. So there's some evidence here that actively open-minded thinking causes people to change their beliefs in the course of their life. That didn't work for utilitarianism. It didn't work for politics. It even worked the wrong way, except remember that they didn't change in politics. So I don't know so there's something odd going on here. They might have moved back to where their parents were or something. But if you remember that graph, people didn't change in politics anyway. So we can't ask what caused the change. So it looks like there was some effect on religion. And almost by definition, there was no effect on actively open-minded thinking because I used both. That shouldn't matter. The more disturbing result here is this one gets a bit, what about that question? I thought about it myself. That actually correlated negatively with becoming more liberal, almost not with actively open-minded thinking itself, but with religion and with politics and mostly with religion. So people who thought about it themselves became more religious. Weird, which contradicts the result I just showed you. So I don't understand what's going on. I mean, so this is a loose end that has to be tied up by further research, but I might as well tell it like it is. However, the more interesting one is, and this is a puzzle too, that question, did people involved in my upbringing try to influence you? And that correlated with positively with change toward cognitive liberalism everywhere. Now, and yet we know that people involved in your upbringing were much more cognitively conservative than you were. So how did this happen? I don't know, but I have one explanation, and the only explanation I can think of is that people rebelled. That is, the things that make people change are when they are continually getting nagged to accept the views that their parents believed, and they rebel against that. So the more pressure they get, the more they change away from where their parents were. I don't know. I can't think of any other explanation, but there must be one. So to conclude, and I will conclude now, there's a positive manifold among measures of deontology, social conservatism, parochialism, religious fundamentalism, and non-acceptance of actively open-minded thinking. Why does this happen? One reason is that some of these traits might affect others. For example, if you think about it a lot, you could become more cosmopolitan. Why should my political beliefs, why is my political obligation just to co-national or just to white people or whatever? Can I give a good reason for that? And failing to find a good reason, you could expand your domain of concern. You could reject moralistic values by saying, why do I have to believe that? And you could become more utilitarian by asking in a skeptical way, why should I follow that rule if it makes things worse? And utilitarianism itself can lead to cosmopolitanism for the same reason. Belief in, and similarly, if you believe in divine command theory, that will make you resist actively open-minded thinking and resist anything else that requires thinking, because you are sort of told that you are incapable of figuring out things for yourself, so don't try. And that may spread to other areas aside from religion. So that's one possible explanation of this positive manifold. The other explanation I said at the beginning is that, which I think must be partly true, is that some standards seem to result from cultural transmission. There's this sticky thing about certain cultures that perpetuate themselves, and you're going to get people like that in any sample. And I think there's some evidence in favor of that. I think divine command theory itself is evidence that this kind of thing happens, because it's hard to imagine that someone naive who hadn't heard of religion or anything like that would come up with that idea by themselves. It's something you have to be taught. And so that has to come from culture. And there's other evidence here that people do respond to culture in various ways. But then the other possibility is that some people become more cognitively liberal. They accept actively open-minded thinking over the course of their life. Some of that is the effect of actively open-minded thinking itself, as we saw in religion. But the puzzle here is thinking about it myself does not explain it. There might just be a flaw in the way we're doing this. But it does seem to happen when people claim that people involved in their upbringing have tried to influence them. Okay, so I'm done, and there's actually time for questions. And we have
a question related to that last point. So here's the question. It was, could it be possible that people who are more actively open-minded were more likely to recognize when people attempted to change their mind in the past, leading to the positive relationship in the graphs?
That's a good idea. Whoever thought of that one?
That was one of our fellows, Jordan.
That's the other explanation I couldn't think of.
All right, so rebellion or recognition.
Recognition, right.
Okay. What about, I have a question. So obviously this feels particularly relevant to where we are in this time in the United States and in the world. So is there any attempt being made to teach actively open-minded thinking?
Yes. There used to be a lot more, and I would say there are some groups that try to do this explicitly in high schools. My own view is that this is happening because teachers are doing it themselves. One of my students, Emma Metz, did a big study of schools around the country. Unfortunately, it didn't include Christian schools, but it did include expensive private schools and poor inner city schools. And the ideology of the children in the 8th grade was so positive toward actively open-minded thinking that there was almost no variation. They had learned from their teachers, from the atmosphere of the school, respect other people, listen to other people. It was mostly in the context of social learning, that is, being respectful of other people, but it's almost become the official ideology of American schools. In colleges, it's also, and it is and has been for a very long time, as close as you can get to the official ideology of what we call liberal education. That is what liberal universities like Penn, the other Ivy Leagues, but also all the small colleges like Haverford and Swarthmore, what they try to do is challenge students, get you to think of things you haven't thought of before, get you to see the other side, and learn to think that way, and also learn that this is how knowledge comes about. That is, if you want to understand science, you really need to know how we got where we are, which is a process of trial and error, finding theories, finding flaws in them, rejecting them, coming up with better theories. And you learn this more in college, unfortunately, than they do in high school, where I think they don't emphasize history of science enough. So yes, and there are also a lot of experiments done on teaching actively open-minded thinking explicitly. One of the best was done by David Perkins in a study he did in 1986, which finally I got him to publish in the journal I edit. So in the last issue of Judgment and Decision Making, or a couple of issues ago, there's an article about this training study he did, which was absolutely astounding in the results it got. And it worked. We've done other training studies too. So yes, you can teach this. I think people do teach it. Yeah, so any other, that's.
I just, one more sort of question, and then I think we're out of time, but It does seem like there's some maybe a bit of a connection with some other work that happens at Penn from the group that's looking at the super forecasters. I believe that the people who are the super forecasters exhibit signs that they're more engaged and actively open-minded thinking. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I was part of that group, and I was a pretty big part of it for the first couple of years of the study they did. And they included, and I forgot to mention this, they included the actively open-minded thinking scale and the cognitive reflection test. And the actively open-minded thinking scale was actually the best of the predictors of being a good forecaster of all the measures that were based on questionnaires. I don't want to scream wow about this, because when I say the best, that was the best of a bunch of very poor predictors. That is, there were other predictors that were much better, including looking at the amount of time people spent on the task, the amount of search they did. That is, if you want to pick good forecasters, it's probably not worthwhile to give this test, but rather to give them tasks more like what they're going to be doing. But yes, they did that. It was very good. It worked. It continued the positive manifold. So yes.
All right, well, we are right up on the time. So I want to thank you again so much for presenting to our group today. And I'll just mention to the audience that next week we have two events. We actually will have, on July 7th, we have a faculty panel who will be talking about what it's like to be faculty, because we expect that there are a number of sort of research track students in our audience, and grad students and postdocs who are hoping to be within those ranks in a few years. That I think is actually going to move off of the Crowdcast platform. It will probably take place on Blue Jeans. So we'll post an update here. It will also be posted on our website, just because we discovered yesterday that there's a limit to 4 people who can be on screen at one time. And I believe we actually have 4 speakers lined up, and then there will be a moderator. And then next week, next Wednesday, July 8th, same time at noon, we'll be joined by another psychology professor, Allison Mackey. So we will see you then. This talk is actually recorded, and the comments will remain open for a while, so you are welcome to post anything there. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a good rest of your Wednesday and a good long weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you again, Professor Barron.
Thank you. Bye.